The afternoon of June 14th, 1948, was hot and humid in Harlem, with temperatures climbing into the upper 80s by 2 o'clock and showing no signs of cooling despite a few scattered clouds that had appeared over Manhattan. The sun beat down relentlessly on the asphalt streets, creating waves of heat that rose visibly from the pavement and made the air shimmer. The humidity was oppressive, causing clothing to stick to skin and making even simple movements feel laborious. People who needed to be outside moved slowly, conserving energy, while those who had the option remained indoors or sought shade wherever they could find it. The streets of Harlem were relatively quiet in the early afternoon heat. Store owners had propped open their doors to encourage whatever breeze might exist to flow through their establishments. Windows on upper floors were open, with residents sitting on fire escapes or leaning out to catch any hint of cooler air. Children who would normally be playing in the streets had retreated to stoops or to parks where trees provided some relief from the direct sun. The neighborhood had the sleepy, sluggish quality that hot summer afternoons brought to New York City before air conditioning became widespread. West 145th Street, near 8th Avenue, was a commercial block with storefronts on the ground level and residential apartments above. The buildings were typical of Harlem construction from the early 20th century. 4 or 5 stories tall, built of brick, with ornate cornices and window frames that reflected the architectural ambitions of developers who had originally built the neighborhood for middle-class white residents before demographic changes transformed Harlem into the center of Black New York. The storefronts housed a variety of businesses: a grocery store, a barber shop, a dressmaker's shop, a restaurant that served Southern-style cooking, and several other establishments that served the local community. The Royal Palace Gaming Club operated from the second floor of a building at 312 West 145th Street, above a shoe repair shop. The entrance to the club was through a doorway adjacent to the shoe repair shop that led to a narrow staircase ascending to the second floor. The staircase was dimly lit even during the day, with worn wooden steps that creaked under weight. At the top of the stairs was a heavy door with a small window at eye level, reinforced with metal bars, through which visitors could be observed before being admitted. The Royal Palace had been established in January 1947 by Marcus Williams, who was 42 years old in June 1948. Williams had spent the previous 20 years working in various capacities in Harlem's gambling industry. He had started as a numbers runner in 1928 at age 22, collecting bets from customers throughout Harlem and delivering them to policy banks that coordinated the illegal lottery operations. Williams had demonstrated reliability and discretion, qualities that were essential in an industry where law enforcement raids were a constant risk, and where theft or betrayal by employees could destroy a business overnight. Over 2 decades, Williams had advanced from numbers runner to bookmaker, managing his own operation that collected bets and paid out winnings. Williams had saved his earnings carefully, living modestly, and avoiding the conspicuous consumption that attracted attention from both law enforcement and criminals who might see wealth as an opportunity for robbery or extortion. By late 1946, Williams had accumulated approximately $8,000 in savings, which he determined was sufficient capital to open his own gaming establishment. Williams had leased the second-floor space at 312 West 145th Street in December 1946. and had spent the following month renovating and equipping the premises. The space consisted of approximately 2,000 square feet divided into 3 rooms, a main gaming room where customers would play, and a back office where Williams would handle administrative matters and keep records, and a small kitchen area where coffee and simple food could be prepared for customers. Williams had installed proper lighting, ventilation fans to combat the heat and smoke from customers' cigarettes, and furnishings including gaming tables for dice and cards, chairs and cabinets for storing equipment and supplies. The Royal Palace had opened for business in January 1947 and had established a steady clientele over the following 18 months. The club operated 6 evenings per week, Tuesday through Sunday, opening at 7 in the evening and closing when the last customers departed, typically between midnight and 2 in the morning. The club offered craps, poker, blackjack, and numbers betting. Stakes were modest, calibrated to the working class and lower middle class black residents who constituted the customer base. Most bets ranged from 50 cents to $5, though some regular customers would occasionally wager larger amounts on particular games or numbers. Williams employed 4 people in addition to himself. 2 dealers worked the gaming tables, 1 handled the numbers operation, and 1 served as doorman and general security. Williams personally supervised operations each evening, managing money, resolving disputes between customers, and ensuring that the establishment maintained the orderly atmosphere that kept customers returning. Williams also handled relationships with the various external entities that affected the club's operations: the landlord who owned the building, the police officers who could shut down the club if they chose to enforce gambling laws strictly, and the criminal organizations that controlled illegal gambling in Harlem. In June 1948, the primary criminal organization controlling Harlem gambling was the network operated by Bumpy Johnson. Johnson did not personally own or manage individual gambling establishments in most cases. Instead, Johnson operated a protection and coordination system. Independent operators like Williams paid monthly fees to Johnson's organization. In exchange, they received several benefits. First, protection from interference by competing criminal groups who might attempt to extort money or force the businesses to close. Second, advance warning of police raids, which allowed operators to clear their premises of incriminating evidence and customers before police arrived. Third, access to Johnson's dispute resolution system, which could mediate conflicts between different operators or between operators and customers when disputes threatened to escalate into violence. Williams paid Johnson's organization $150 per month. This represented approximately 15% of the Royal Palace's net profits. Williams considered this a reasonable expense. The protection was genuine and effective. In the 18 months the Royal Palace had been operating, Williams had never experienced attempts at extortion from other criminal groups, had received advance warning of 2 police raids that would have resulted in arrests and confiscation of money and equipment, and had been able to resolve 2 disputes with customers through Johnson's organization rather than through methods that might have attracted police attention or resulted in violence. On the afternoon of June 14th, Williams was at the Royal Palace with 2 of his employees, James Peterson and Robert Hayes. Peterson and Hayes were preparing the club for the evening's operations. This preparation involved cleaning the gaming room from the previous night's business, checking and maintaining the gaming equipment, restocking supplies including cards and dice that would be needed, and counting and organizing the money that would be needed for making change and paying out winnings. Williams was in his office reviewing accounts and planning which numbers he would accept bets on that evening based on recent patterns of customer betting and payouts. At approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, Williams heard Peterson call out from the main gaming room. Peterson stated that several men had arrived and were requesting to speak with Williams. Williams emerged from his office and observed 3 white men standing in the gaming room. The men were dressed in suits despite the heat. The suits were well-tailored and expensive, suggesting professional status and financial resources. The men were in their 30s or 40s, with the bearing and manner of people accustomed to authority and to having their instructions followed without question. Williams approached the men and asked how he could assist them. The men did not immediately respond to this question. Instead, they began walking through the gaming room, examining the tables, chairs, and equipment with the careful attention of people conducting an inspection or appraisal. They opened cabinets and looked inside. They examined the ventilation system. They walked to the windows and looked out at the street below. They entered the kitchen area and office and conducted similar examinations. This inspection continued for approximately 5 minutes while Williams, Peterson, and Hayes watched without interfering. After completing their examination of the premises, the apparent leader of the 3 men approached Williams directly. The man was approximately 40 years old, approximately 6 feet tall, with dark hair combed back from his forehead and held in place with pomade. He wore a gray suit with a white shirt and burgundy tie. His shoes were polished to a high shine. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who expected to be taken seriously and who was unaccustomed to being challenged or contradicted. The man introduced himself as Vincent Battaglia. He stated that he was a representative of the Moretti family, which he described as an organization with business interests throughout New York City. Battaglia stated that the Moretti family had made a decision to expand their operations into Harlem, and that this expansion would include oversight of gambling establishments in the neighborhood. Battaglia stated that all gambling operators in Harlem would now be required to work with the Moretti family according to terms that the family would establish. Battaglia explained that the terms would include monthly payments to the Moretti family, compliance with operational guidelines that the family would specify, and submission to periodic inspections to ensure compliance. Battaglia stated that the monthly payment required from the Royal Palace would be $300, which represented a doubling of what Williams currently paid to Johnson's organization. Battaglia also stated that the Moretti family would determine what games could be offered, what hours the club could operate, and what customers would be permitted to patronize the establishment. Williams listened to this presentation without interrupting. When Battaglia finished, Williams stated that he already had arrangements for protection and operational support through an established organization in Harlem, and that these arrangements were working satisfactorily. Williams stated that he had no interest in changing these arrangements or in establishing a relationship with the Moretti family. Williams spoke calmly and politely, without hostility or aggression, simply making clear that he was declining the proposition that Battaglia had presented. Battaglia's expression did not change. He stated that Williams appeared to misunderstand the situation. Battaglia explained that the Moretti family's decision to expand into Harlem was not a proposal that operators could accept or decline according to their preferences. The expansion was happening regardless of individual preferences. Operators who cooperated with the Moretti family would be able to continue their businesses under the family's oversight. Operators who refused to cooperate would discover that their businesses could not continue operating. And Battaglia stated that Williams had 1 week to consider the matter and to make arrangements to begin making payments to the Moretti family. Battaglia stated that he would return to the Royal Palace on June 21st to finalize the arrangements. Battaglia stated that if Williams had not agreed to the terms by that time, the Moretti family would take whatever actions were necessary to close the Royal Palace permanently. Battaglia did not specify what these actions might be, allowing the ambiguity to carry its own implicit threat. Williams did not respond immediately to these statements. Williams had operated in Harlem's gambling industry for 2 decades and had encountered threats and pressure from various sources during that time. Williams understood that responding emotionally or confrontationally to threats typically escalated situations in ways that created worse outcomes. Williams also understood that accepting Battaglia's terms immediately would establish a pattern of compliance that would make it difficult to resist additional demands in the future. Williams stated that he would need time to consider the matter and to consult with his business advisors. Williams stated that he understood Battaglia's position and that he would provide a response within the time frame Battaglia had specified. Williams did not commit to accepting Battaglia's terms, but he also did not explicitly refuse them. Williams kept his tone neutral and professional, treating the conversation as a business discussion rather than as a confrontation. Battaglia appeared satisfied with this response. He stated that he looked forward to finalizing the arrangements the following week. Battaglia and his 2 associates then departed the Royal Palace, descending the stairs and exiting onto West 145th Street. Williams watched from the window as the 3 men walked to a car parked half a block away, entered the car, and drove off heading south toward Midtown Manhattan. After the men departed, Peterson and Hayes asked Williams what he intended to do. Williams stated that he needed to contact certain people who could provide advice about how to handle the situation. Williams instructed Peterson and Hayes to continue preparing for the evening's operations and to say nothing to customers or to anyone else about the visit from Battaglia and his associates. Williams stated that he would address the matter and that Peterson and Hayes should focus on their normal responsibilities. Williams left the Royal Palace at approximately 2:45 and walked to a public telephone booth 2 blocks away on 8th Avenue. Williams called Thomas Jefferson, who was one of Bumpy Johnson's senior lieutenants and who served as Williams's primary contact with Johnson's organization. Jefferson was responsible for coordinating protection arrangements with approximately 30 gambling establishments throughout Harlem, collecting the monthly payments and ensuring that operators received the services they paid for. Williams explained to Jefferson what had occurred at the Royal Palace. Williams provided descriptions of Battaglia and his 2 associates, including their physical appearances, the car they had been driving, and the specific terms they had demanded. Jefferson listened carefully and asked several clarifying questions about exactly what Battaglia had said and about whether Battaglia had made any explicit threats of violence. Williams recounted the conversation as precisely as he could remember it, Jefferson stated that Williams should continue operating the royal palace normally and should not agree to any arrangements with Battaglia or the Moretti family. Jefferson stated that he would bring the matter to Johnson's attention immediately and that Johnson would address the situation. Jefferson stated that Williams should expect to hear back within 24 hours about how to proceed. Jefferson also stated that if Battaglia or anyone associated with him returned to the royal palace before Jefferson contacted Williams again, Williams should call Jefferson immediately. Jefferson contacted Johnson that same afternoon at approximately 3:30. Johnson was at his apartment on West 147th Street when Jefferson called. Jefferson explained the situation involving Battaglia, the Moretti family, and the royal palace. Johnson asked detailed questions about the timeline of events, about exactly what Battaglia had said, and about Williams's response. Johnson also asked whether Jefferson had heard any reports of similar approaches to other gambling operators in Harlem. Jefferson stated that he had not received any other reports, but that he would make inquiries. Bumpy Johnson was 42 years old in June 1948. Johnson had been born in Charleston, South Carolina in October 1905 and had moved to Harlem in 1919 at age 13 to live with his sister Mabel after his older brother Willie had been accused of killing a white man and the family feared retaliation. Johnson had spent the following 29 years building power and influence in Harlem's criminal economy. Johnson had worked initially as a runner and enforcer for various criminal operators, had served multiple prison terms for various offenses, and had eventually established his own organization that controlled significant portions of Harlem's gambling operations. Johnson understood immediately that Battaglia's approach to Williams represented a serious challenge that extended far beyond one gambling club. If Johnson allowed an outside crime family to establish a presence in Harlem by taking control of even a single gambling establishment, that success would encourage additional incursions. Other crime families would interpret Johnson's failure to prevent the Moretti takeover as evidence that Johnson lacked the capacity or willingness to defend his territory. Additional families would attempt their own expansions into Harlem. Johnson's credibility with the operators who paid him for protection would be undermined, and the entire structure of Harlem's gambling economy that Johnson had spent decades building could collapse. Johnson also recognized that responding effectively required understanding exactly what he was dealing with. Who was the Moretti family? How powerful were they? What resources did they have? Why had they chosen this particular moment to attempt expansion into Harlem? Did they have support from other crime families? Were they acting independently or as part of a broader, coordinated effort? Had they already made approaches to other Harlem operators that Jefferson was not yet aware of? These questions needed to be answered before Johnson could determine the appropriate response. Johnson began gathering information that same afternoon. Johnson contacted Detective Robert Harrison of the New York Police Department. Harrison worked in the NYPD's Organized Crime Unit and had maintained a working relationship with Johnson for approximately 6 years. The relationship was mutually beneficial. Harrison received information from Johnson about criminal activities that Harrison wanted to investigate or prevent. and Johnson received advance warning about police operations that might affect his interests and information about rival criminal groups that helped Johnson navigate the complex landscape of New York's organized crime. Harrison confirmed that the Moretti family was a Sicilian-American crime organization based in Brooklyn. The family had been operating in New York since the early 1920s. The family's core business was gambling operations, including illegal casinos, bookmaking, and numbers games similar to those operated in Harlem. The family also engaged in loan sharking and labor racketeering, controlling several unions in the construction and waterfront industries in Brooklyn. The family was led by Antonio Moretti, who was approximately 60 years old and who had immigrated to New York from Sicily in 1911 at age 23. Harrison stated that the Moretti family had approximately 40 members or associates who worked directly for the organization. The family controlled gambling operations in several Brooklyn neighborhoods, including Bensonhurst, Gravesend, and Bay Ridge. The family generated revenues estimated at approximately $100,000 per year from gambling alone, with additional revenues from their other criminal enterprises. The family had relationships with other Italian-American crime families in New York, but operated largely independently within their Brooklyn territory. Harrison also provided information about Vincent Battaglia specifically. Battaglia was Antonio Moretti's nephew, the son of Moretti's younger sister, who had also immigrated to New York from Sicily. Battaglia was 38 years old and had been working for the Moretti family since age 16. Battaglia served as an enforcer and organizer for the family, handling situations that required intimidation or violence and coordinating the family's expansion into new territories or business lines. Battaglia had been arrested 4 times for assault and once for extortion, but had never been convicted, either because witnesses refused to testify or because prosecutors could not develop sufficient evidence for trial. Harrison explained that the Moretti family's attempt to expand into Harlem likely reflected recent developments in Brooklyn. Over the previous 6 months, the Moretti family had lost control of several profitable gambling operations to competing crime families. These losses had resulted from territorial disputes that had escalated into violence, with several Moretti associates killed or seriously injured. The violence had attracted increased police attention to Moretti operations, resulting in raids and arrests that had disrupted the family's remaining Brooklyn gambling businesses. The family's revenues had declined significantly, creating financial pressure to replace lost income by expanding into new territories. Johnson also contacted Michael Romano, who operated a construction business in Harlem and who had extensive business relationships with Italian-American businessmen and criminals in Brooklyn. Romano had grown up in Brooklyn before moving to Harlem in the 1930s and had maintained connections in both communities. Though Romano could provide insights into the Moretti family's operations and could potentially serve as an intermediary for communications between Johnson and the family if that became necessary. Romano confirmed Harrison's assessment of the Moretti family's recent difficulties. Romano stated that the family was widely perceived in Brooklyn criminal circles as weakened and vulnerable. Several of the family's most experienced members had been killed in recent territorial disputes. Antonio Moretti himself was getting older and was believed to be less capable of the strategic thinking and decisive action that had built the family's power decades earlier. The family's finances were strained, making it difficult for them to respond effectively to challenges from competitors. Romano also stated that the Moretti family's attempt to expand into Harlem had not been coordinated with or approved by other major Italian-American crime families operating in New York. The major families, the Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno organizations, maintained an informal system for managing territorial boundaries and for approving or disapproving expansions by smaller families into contested territories. The Moretti family had apparently decided to attempt Harlem expansion without seeking this approval, possibly because they believed approval would be denied, or because they felt they could not afford to wait for a lengthy negotiation process. This information was significant. If the Moretti family was acting independently without support from the major families, and Johnson could respond to the Moretti challenge without risking conflict with more powerful organizations. If Johnson had to confront multiple families acting in coordination, the situation would be far more dangerous. But if this was simply the Moretti family attempting a desperate expansion to compensate for Brooklyn losses, Johnson could address it through a combination of deterrence and negotiation that would end the challenge without broader escalation. Over the following 2 days, June 15th and 16th, Johnson continued gathering intelligence and planning his response. Johnson had Jefferson conduct a systematic survey of all gambling operators in Harlem who paid protection to Johnson's organization. Jefferson contacted each operator and asked whether they had received any approaches from unfamiliar individuals attempting to collect payments or establish new arrangements. This survey revealed that Williams's Royal Palace was the only establishment that had been approached by Battaglia or anyone associated with the Moretti family. This pattern suggested that the Moretti family was testing Harlem's defenses by approaching a single operator before attempting broader expansion. If Williams capitulated to Battaglia's demands without resistance, the Moretti family would likely interpret this as evidence that Harlem operators were vulnerable and would proceed to approach additional establishments. If Williams resisted and the Moretti family succeeded in forcing compliance through intimidation or violence, that outcome would also encourage expansion. Only if Williams resisted and the Moretti family was decisively prevented from establishing control would the expansion attempt fail. Johnson decided that his response needed to accomplish several objectives simultaneously. First, protect the royal palace, specifically by ensuring that Battaglia could not successfully intimidate Williams or interfere with the club's operations. Second, communicate clearly to the Moretti family that their attempted expansion into Harlem would not succeed and that they needed to withdraw completely. Third, demonstrate to other crime families that Johnson maintained effective control over Harlem and that attempts to establish operations in the neighborhood without Johnson's approval would fail. Fourth, accomplish all of this without creating the kind of spectacular violence that would attract law enforcement attention or destabilize Harlem's criminal economy. Johnson began assembling a coalition of people who could assist with different aspects of this response. The coalition needed to include people with different types of expertise and different types of connections who could address different dimensions of the challenge. Johnson had learned over 29 years in Harlem's criminal economy that effective responses to serious challenges required coordinated efforts involving multiple capabilities that no single person or organization possessed entirely. Johnson recruited Michael Romano to serve as the coalition's primary source of intelligence about the Moretti family's Brooklyn operations and as a potential intermediary for direct communication with the family, if that became necessary. Romano had demonstrated reliability in previous matters and had the specific knowledge of Brooklyn's Italian-American criminal networks that would be essential for understanding how to pressure or negotiate with the Moretti family effectively. Johnson recruited Sarah Mitchell, who worked as a secretary at a Manhattan law firm that represented several organized crime figures in legal matters ranging from criminal defense to business disputes. Mitchell had access to information about ongoing criminal investigations, about relationships between different crime families, and about financial transactions that might reveal vulnerabilities or pressure points. Mitchell had provided valuable intelligence to Johnson on several previous occasions and had proven capable of discretion and careful analysis. Johnson recruited Reverend Samuel Davis from Mount Olive Baptist Church on West 141st Street. Davis had credibility throughout Harlem as a community leader and advocate for black residents' interests. Davis could help frame Johnson's response to the Moretti challenge, not simply as a conflict between criminal organizations, but as a defense of Harlem's independence and of black-owned businesses against attempted takeover by outside forces. This framing would strengthen Johnson's position with Harlem residents and would make it more difficult for the Moretti family to establish relationships with anyone in the neighborhood who might assist their expansion efforts. Johnson also identified members of his own organization who would implement the direct protective and enforcement measures that would be required. Thomas Jefferson would coordinate overall operations and would serve as the primary liaison with Williams. James Wilson would organize the security detail that would protect the royal palace from any attempts at interference or intimidation. Robert Chen would conduct surveillance of Battaglia and his associates to document their movements and to identify patterns that might reveal vulnerabilities or opportunities. The coalition's strategy was designed to unfold over approximately 2 weeks, from June 15th through June 28th. The strategy had 4 major components that would be executed in coordinated sequence. First, establish immediate protective measures around the royal palace to prevent any interference while Johnson gathered intelligence and planned comprehensive responses. Second, gather detailed intelligence about the Moretti family's operations, finances, vulnerabilities, and relationships to identify effective pressure points. Third, communicate directly with Antonio Moretti to make clear that the attempted Harlem expansion would not succeed, and to offer him the opportunity to withdraw without further escalation. Fourth, demonstrate Johnson's continuing effective control over Harlem through visible actions that would be observed by other crime families and by Harlem residents. Johnson implemented the first component of the strategy beginning on June 15th. Wilson organized a security detail consisting of 6 members of Johnson's organization working in 2 rotating shifts of 3 people each. The security detail was stationed near the royal palace at all times when the club was open for business and during daytime hours when Williams was present preparing for evening operations. The security personnel maintained positions that allowed them to observe anyone approaching the building and to intercept anyone who appeared to be conducting surveillance or preparing to interfere with the club's operations. The security presence was deliberately visible. Johnson wanted Battaglia and the Moretti family to understand that the royal palace was under Johnson's protection and that any attempt to approach the club would be detected and prevented. Visible security also communicated to other Harlem operators that Johnson was responding actively to the Moretti challenge, which helped maintain confidence in Johnson's protection system and prevented operators from considering whether they should negotiate independently with the Moretti family. Chen began surveillance of Battaglia and his associates on June 16th. Chen used contacts in Brooklyn to identify where Battaglia lived, where he conducted business, and what his regular routines and movements were. Chen learned that Battaglia lived in a house in Bensonhurst that was owned by the Moretti family. Battaglia spent most days at a social club on 86th Street that served as the Moretti family's informal headquarters. Battaglia typically arrived at the club around 10 in the morning and remained there until evening, conducting business and meeting with various associates. Chen also documented that Battaglia made regular visits to several gambling establishments that the Moretti family operated in Brooklyn. These visits appeared to serve both supervisory purposes, ensuring that the establishments were operating according to family policies, and collection purposes, as Battaglia would typically leave these establishments carrying bags or briefcases that presumably contained cash revenues. Chen photographed these visits and documented the timing and patterns, creating a detailed record of Battaglia's movements that might reveal vulnerabilities or opportunities for applying pressure. Romano conducted his own inquiries about the Moretti family's Brooklyn operations through his business contacts. Romano learned that the family was operating 4 gambling establishments in Brooklyn as of June 1948, down from 7 establishments in January 1948. The 3 establishments that had been lost represented approximately 30% of the family's gambling revenues. The losses had been devastating to the family's finances and had created serious internal tensions, with some family members questioning Antonio Moretti's leadership and his decisions about how to respond to challenges from competing families. Romano also learned that the Moretti family had significant outstanding debts to several loan sharks who operated in Brooklyn. These debts had been incurred to finance the family's operations during their recent territorial disputes. The debts totaled approximately $40,000 and were generating monthly interest payments of approximately $4,000. The family was struggling to make these interest payments while also covering their regular operating expenses and paying their members and associates. The financial pressure was severe and was likely driving the family's desperate attempt to expand into new territory to generate replacement revenues. Mitchell reviewed information available through her law firm position and learned that the NYPD's Organized Crime Unit had recently increased surveillance of Moretti family operations in response to the violence associated with the family's territorial disputes. The increased surveillance had not yet resulted in major arrests, but it had disrupted the family's operations by making it more difficult for them to conduct business without fear of police observation. Mitchell also learned that federal investigators from the Bureau of Narcotics had begun looking into possible involvement by the Moretti family in heroin distribution, though this investigation was in very early stages and had not developed substantial evidence. By June 20th, 6 days after Battaglia's initial visit to the royal palace, Johnson had developed a comprehensive understanding of the Moretti family's situation. The family was financially strained, operationally disrupted, facing increased law enforcement scrutiny, and attempting a desperate expansion into Harlem without support from other major crime families. These circumstances created both vulnerabilities that Johnson could exploit and opportunities for negotiated resolution that would allow the Moretti family to withdraw without losing too much face. Johnson decided that the most effective approach would be direct communication with Antonio Moretti himself rather than with Battaglia. Johnson wanted to make clear that he understood the Moretti family's situation comprehensively, that he had the capacity to make that situation significantly worse if the family persisted with the Harlem expansion, and that he was willing to allow the family to withdraw without further consequences if they did so immediately. This approach offered Moretti a way out that preserved some dignity while making clear that continued expansion attempts would result in serious consequences. Johnson arranged a meeting with Antonio Moretti through intermediaries. Michael Romano contacted a Brooklyn businessman who had relationships with the Moretti family and explained that Johnson wished to discuss the situation regarding Harlem operations. The businessman conveyed this message to Moretti. Moretti agreed to meet with Johnson on June 22nd at a restaurant in Midtown Manhattan that served as neutral territory where neither Johnson nor Moretti would have home advantage. The meeting occurred on the afternoon of June 22nd at Rosario's restaurant on 3rd Avenue near 42nd Street. Johnson arrived at 1:30 accompanied by Thomas Jefferson. Moretti arrived at 1:45, accompanied by Vincent Battaglia and another family member whose name Johnson did not learn. The restaurant's owner had arranged a private dining room for the meeting, where the conversation would not be overheard by other patrons or staff. Antonio Moretti was 60 years old in June 1948. Moretti had immigrated to New York from Sicily in 1911 and had spent the following 37 years building the criminal organization that bore his name. Moretti was a heavy-set man with gray hair and a lined face that reflected decades of stress and conflict. Moretti moved slowly and appeared to be in declining health, though his eyes remained alert and calculating. Johnson began the conversation by acknowledging that he understood the Moretti family was attempting to expand operations into Harlem. Johnson stated that this expansion would not be permitted to succeed and that the family needed to withdraw immediately. Johnson stated this calmly and directly, without hostility or emotional intensity, simply making clear what the outcome would be. Moretti responded by stating that the Moretti family had as much right to operate gambling establishments in Harlem as Johnson did. Moretti stated that territorial boundaries in New York's criminal economy were not permanently fixed, and that families had the right to expand into new areas when opportunities presented themselves. Moretti stated that if Johnson wanted to prevent this expansion, Johnson would need to offer something in exchange, perhaps shared control over Harlem operations or a percentage of revenues. Johnson stated that Harlem was not available for negotiation. Johnson explained that he had controlled Harlem's gambling operations for approximately 15 years, and that this control was recognized and respected by all major crime families operating in New York. Johnson stated that the Moretti family's attempt to change this arrangement demonstrated either lack of awareness of how New York's criminal territories were organized or deliberate disrespect for established boundaries and for Johnson's authority. Johnson then shifted to explaining exactly what would happen if the Moretti family persisted with the Harlem expansion. Johnson stated that he was aware of the family's recent difficulties in Brooklyn, including the loss of gambling operations to competitors, the financial pressures created by outstanding debts, and the increased law enforcement scrutiny of family activities. Johnson stated that if the Moretti family continued attempting to operate in Harlem, Johnson would take specific actions designed to make the family's situation significantly worse. First, Johnson would provide information to law enforcement about Moretti family operations in Brooklyn. This information would include details about gambling establishments, about loan sharking activities, and about any other criminal operations that Johnson's intelligence gathering had identified. This information would enable law enforcement to conduct raids and arrests that would disrupt the family's remaining Brooklyn operations and would further reduce their revenues. Second, Johnson would communicate with the Moretti family's Brooklyn competitors and would offer to support their efforts to take over additional Moretti operations. This support could include intelligence about Moretti vulnerabilities, financial assistance to competitors, or coordination of actions designed to create maximum pressure on the family simultaneously from multiple directions. Third, Johnson would communicate with the loan sharks who held the Moretti family's outstanding debts and would encourage them to demand immediate repayment rather than accepting continued monthly interest payments. Johnson stated that he had relationships with several of these loan sharks and that they would be receptive to suggestions from him about how to handle the Moretti accounts. Johnson stated that these three actions, executed simultaneously, would likely destroy what remained of the Moretti family's operations in Brooklyn within a matter of weeks. The family would lose its remaining gambling establishments, would face immediate financial crisis from debt demands they could not meet, and would be unable to defend itself against coordinated pressure from law enforcement and competitors. Johnson stated this without emotional intensity, simply describing the consequences as a series of actions that would follow logically from the family's decision to persist with Harlem expansion. Johnson then offered the alternative. If the Moretti family withdrew from Harlem immediately, Johnson would take none of these actions. The family could continue operating its remaining Brooklyn establishments without interference from Johnson, and the family's difficulties would remain the family's own concern rather than being amplified by Johnson's intervention. The family would lose face by having failed in an expansion attempt, but that loss would be limited compared to the catastrophic consequences of persisting. Moretti listened to this presentation without interrupting. When Johnson finished, Moretti sat silently for approximately 2 minutes, considering his options. Battaglia appeared ready to argue or to threaten, but Moretti gestured for him to remain quiet. Moretti understood that Johnson had prepared thoroughly, that Johnson had identified real vulnerabilities in the Moretti family's position, and that Johnson had the capacity and apparently the willingness to execute the actions he had described. Moretti stated that he would consider Johnson's proposal and would provide a response within 48 hours. Johnson stated that this was acceptable but made clear that any further approaches to Harlem gambling operators during this consideration period would be interpreted as rejection of the proposal and would result in Johnson immediately beginning the actions he had described. Moretti agreed that no further approaches would be made while he considered the matter. The meeting concluded at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon. Johnson and Jefferson returned to Harlem. Moretti and his associates returned to Brooklyn. Johnson instructed Jefferson to maintain the security detail at the Royal Palace and to continue surveillance of Battaglia to ensure that the Moretti family honored the commitment to make no further approaches while Moretti considered the proposal. On June 24th, 40 hours after the meeting at Rosario's restaurant, Johnson received a message from the same intermediary who had arranged the meeting. Moretti had decided to accept Johnson's proposal. The Moretti family would withdraw from any attempts to establish operations in Harlem. Vincent Battaglia would not return to the Royal Palace or approach any other Harlem gambling operators. In exchange, Johnson would not interfere with Moretti family operations in Brooklyn or take any of the actions Johnson had described during the meeting. To confirm this agreement, Battaglia visited the Royal Palace one final time on June 25th. Battaglia informed Marcus Williams that the Moretti family would not be pursuing any relationship with the Royal Palace or with any other Harlem establishments. Battaglia stated that Williams should continue his existing arrangements and that there would be no further contact between the Moretti family and Williams. Williams reported this conversation to Johnson through Jefferson, who confirmed that the matter was resolved as Johnson had intended. Johnson maintained the security detail at the Royal Palace for an additional 2 weeks through July 9th to ensure that the Moretti family honored its commitment and to demonstrate to Williams and to other Harlem operators that Johnson's protection was thorough and reliable. During this period, no further contact occurred between anyone associated with the Moretti family and anyone in Harlem. Chen's surveillance confirmed that Battaglia had ceased any activities related to Harlem and had returned to focusing entirely on Brooklyn operations. The Royal Palace Gaming Club continued operating successfully under Williams's ownership for the following 7 years. Williams maintained his monthly protection payments to Johnson's organization without interruption. Williams never experienced any further attempts at interference from outside crime families or from any other source beyond the normal challenges of operating an illegal gambling establishment in a neighborhood where police periodically conducted raids in response to political pressure or public complaints. Williams eventually retired from the gambling business in 1955 at age 49 and sold the Royal Palace to another operator who continued running the establishment for several more years. Williams later told other gambling operators that Johnson's response to the Moretti family's attempted takeover had demonstrated that protection payments to Johnson's organization were worth the cost because the protection was genuine and would be enforced even against serious threats from powerful outside organizations. For Johnson himself, the Moretti family incident represented a test of whether he could maintain control over Harlem against challenges from organized crime families that believed Harlem might be vulnerable to outside takeover. But the test had arisen during a period when Johnson might have appeared vulnerable. He had recently served a prison term and had been out of prison for only a few years, which might have created perceptions that his organization had weakened during his incarceration. Johnson had responded by demonstrating that his organization remained capable of gathering comprehensive intelligence, establishing effective security, and applying coordinated pressure through multiple channels simultaneously. Johnson had avoided spectacular violence that might have attracted law enforcement attention or destabilized Harlem's criminal economy. Instead, Johnson had used intelligence, negotiation, and credible threats of consequences to achieve his objectives. The incident reinforced understanding among other crime families operating in New York that Harlem remained under Johnson's effective control, and that attempts to establish operations in the neighborhood without Johnson's approval would not succeed. This understanding helped maintain stability in Harlem's gambling economy by preventing repeated challenges from various families who might otherwise have tested whether Johnson would defend his territory against each new attempt. The incident also provided Johnson with useful intelligence about his own organization's capabilities and about the effectiveness of his coalition-building approach to addressing serious challenges. The combination of street-level security, business world intelligence gathering, law enforcement relationships, and community framing had produced a coordinated response that addressed multiple dimensions of the challenge simultaneously. This approach could serve as a template for responding to future challenges. For the Harlem community and for Black-owned businesses, the incident provided evidence that Johnson would protect local enterprises from attempted takeovers by outside crime families. The story of how Johnson had prevented the Moretti family from taking control of Williams's gambling club circulated throughout Harlem and became one of many narratives about Johnson's role as defender of Harlem's independence against external threats. The incident generated discussion and debate about how to interpret Johnson's actions. Some observers argued that Johnson had genuinely protected a Black-owned business from being taken over by a more powerful white criminal organization, and that this protection represented a form of community defense against external exploitation. These observers pointed out that if the Moretti family had succeeded in taking control of the royal palace, Williams would have lost his business, and the revenues would have flowed to Brooklyn rather than remaining in Harlem. Other observers argued that Johnson was simply defending his own financial interests and his own territory against competition from a rival criminal organization. These observers pointed out that Williams was paying Johnson $150 per month for protection. That Johnson had responded to the Moretti challenge primarily to ensure that these payments continued flowing to his organization rather than to a competitor, and that describing this as community protection gave Johnson undeserved credit for what was essentially self-interested business protection. These different interpretations reflected broader debates about how to understand Johnson's role in Harlem. Was Johnson a community protector who defended Harlem residents and businesses against external threats? Was Johnson simply a criminal who extracted money from Harlem through protection rackets and who defended his territory against competitors for purely selfish reasons? Were both characterizations simultaneously true? Reflecting the complex reality that Johnson's self-interest in maintaining control over Harlem's criminal economy sometimes aligned with community interests in preventing outside exploitation. These questions remained contested and unresolved. What remained beyond dispute was that the Moretti family withdrew from Harlem after Johnson's intervention. that Williams's gambling club continued operating without interference, that other Harlem gambling establishments were not challenged by outside crime families in subsequent years, and that Johnson's control over Harlem's gambling economy remained intact throughout the 1940s and into the 1950s until his arrest and imprisonment on drug charges in 1952. The pattern established by Johnson's response to the Moretti challenge, thorough intelligence gathering, coordinated coalition building, and direct negotiation backed by credible threats and avoidance of spectacular violence, became characteristic of how Johnson addressed subsequent challenges to his authority in Harlem. This approach reflected Johnson's understanding that maintaining power over an extended period required strategic thinking and systematic organization rather than impulsive reactions or demonstrations of force that might produce short-term victories but created longer-term vulnerabilities. This was the reality of how power operated when wielded by someone who understood that defending territory required comprehensive intelligence about challengers' capabilities and vulnerabilities, that preventing takeovers required demonstrating capacity for escalation that extended beyond the immediate dispute, that maintaining control required clear communication about boundaries and consequences, that effective responses required coordinating multiple pressure points simultaneously, and that enduring authority came from consistent strategic execution rather than from occasional dramatic confrontations that attracted attention but did not address underlying structural challenges.